Welcome to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Plan Giving Perspectives. I'm your host, Grant Miller. Today, we'll dive deep into possibly the most important people in your organization's plan giving program, your donors. To your plan giving donors, your organization is family. How do we build and sustain relationships that deepen trust, inspire continued or even expanded generosity, and connect donors more deeply to the mission they care about? In this episode, we'll explore practical strategies for planning donor visits, common pitfalls, and other ideas for building relationships with the people who are vital to your organization's success. Today I'm joined by Sharpe Group Senior Consultant Joe Chickey. Joe, thanks for being on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be with you, Grant. Looking forward to our visit today.
Yeah, I look forward to our conversation. Let's start with a broad topic. Why is relationship building so critical in plan giving?
So that's a great question to begin our discussion today, Grant. I'll begin by telling a story. Early in my career, I had the privilege of hearing Robert Sharpe Sr., who founded our firm, the Sharpe Group, a number of years ago. I had a chance to hear him speak. And the one thing that he said that still resonates with me and has for many years is that when people are thinking about who they're going to leave their wealth to and thinking about their legacy, they think first about family, right? It's a spouse, it's children, it's grandchildren, it's nieces and nephews. But maybe, just maybe, there is a charity that they're so passionate about, they will name them as a member of their family. And it's so critical in our work. If we don't treat them as a member of our family, then they're going to change their plans. And it's really that simple. So we have to view this from the lens of the donor. Our work has to be so donor-centric. So that's really where it all begins. We want to build a relationship so that they see us as a member of their family.
I think that's a great point. Working day in and day out in any field, really, you can start to take some of the most important things for granted, it seems like. And just remembering that these donors leaving you in their estate plans is a really, really big deal, and it should be treated as such. So how soon after a donor indicates interest in your organization should stewardship begin, and what's the first step?
So one thing about the fundraising world, anytime anybody makes a gift or commits to giving a gift, stewardship starts now, right? The sooner you say thank you and the more often you say thank you, the better the relationship is that you build over time. But we have to talk a little bit about what's unique about this plan giving space. So most fundraisers understand there's sort of three categories of giving. That regular or annual giving, so people that give to you every year or maybe more than once a year, but to support your ongoing work. And that's really important as you build that relationship. And they may be 20 or 30 or 40 when they start doing that. They might also be somebody who's a little bit older. Then we may have an opportunity to build a relationship with them when we're doing some sort of a campaign. We're building a new building or we want to grow our endowment. So then we can have conversations about a special gift. And typically those people are going to be 50 or 60. They've at least lived long enough to where they've acquired some assets and they have some wealth. Maybe they feel better about their situation and they want to give back. Now's their opportunity. And then that third category, which we term the ultimate gift, is going to happen later in life. And it really, when they reach that point where they start thinking about their true legacy, and certainly they want to take care of their family. But again, there may be this charity or several charities that they're very passionate about that they want to have an impact with those organizations and help them continue to do all the incredible work that they're doing. So the thing that we talk about most in the plan giving space is this ultimate gift category. And we classify that as the largest gift someone has the donative intent to make. So that doesn't mean they won't do multiple gifts at this later stage, but likely that's going to be the largest gift that they ever make to charity or to several charities. So that's why it takes so many years to build these relationships I'll share another quick story. When I went to work for the University of Illinois, I had my first donor visit 3 weeks after I started working with the organization. And it was an alum from our School of Engineering who had built bridges all over the world. And he had grown up in Chicago, but he had spent a good portion of his working career living in New York, traveling around the world to build all these bridges. And he had never had any children, but he had been married twice, and both of his wives passed away with breast cancer. So he outlived both of them. And he was in his late 70s when I first met him, and he made this decision after his second wife passed away that it was time for him to come back to Chicago. He was a huge Chicago Cubs fan, and he said, I'm going to find a home where I can see Wrigley Field. And there were a bunch of little condos being built in that window around Wrigley Field, where, of course, the Chicago Cubs play. So he bought this home and he moved there. So when I first met with him, he said, I'd be happy to meet you for lunch, but I would love to take you to a Chicago Cubs game. So needless to say, I went to a few games. But the interesting thing about the early part of that relationship, and he was a generous donor. He made many annual gifts over the years, and he had really supported the organization. And he had said to me multiple times, I would not be in the place I am today and have had the success in my career without the university, and I'm eternally grateful. But what was fascinating is that he did not want to talk about his legacy. He really wanted to talk about the two women who had been so important to him. And so we had a number of meetings, and he made some nice gifts. But it was probably year 3 or year 4 when he finally said to me, Joe, I really do want to help the School of Engineering at the university. But he said, I have to be very candid with you. I really don't have any respect for their current leadership. The dean there, she and I just don't see eye to eye. So then we learned how to be creative in our business, right? And clearly, with a little research on my part, it was obvious that there were some other people who weren't as happy with this new leadership that we had had in place for a while. And so I went to our leadership team and I said, look, do we think it's about time for our current dean to retire? And long story short, it took us a couple years, but he actually ended up retiring. And then we went back to Bud, that was the donor's name, and said, hey, we would be so honored if you would chair our search committee for our new dean. This is kind of how we build these unique relationships. And of course, he was happy to do that. He helped us handpick the new dean. And then we spent some more time talking to him, and I was at the university for almost 8 years, and Bud was the first donor that I met with and the last donor that I met with. So literally in our last meeting, we finalized his estate gift to the university, which was significant. Now, the good news here is he had made many wonderful gifts over that time frame, but it just tells us building these long-term relationships and building it on a time frame that fits the donor. The donor has to be ready. And that's a big part of this, figuring out where they are in their life cycle, when they're ready to make these gifts. And he did many wonderful things. But again, it was an 8-year window, and I was fortunate to be there during that whole time frame to help bring this to conclusion.
So you developed a pretty solid relationship with that donor over time. And you mentioned some of the strategies for fostering these long-term relationships, because organizations might be stewarding these donors for decades. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It's not unusual. I mean, if you think of somebody in their 30s and 40s who makes their first gift, it could be many years after you're gone before that gift comes to fruition, if it's a traditional bequest gift or some sort of an estate gift. So you do in the planned giving field many times find that you're working with people in their 70s and 80s, even into their 90s. There's significant gifts for people over 90 now that are passing away and leaving significant gifts to organizations. But yeah, you bring up a good point. Sometimes I say it's more of an art than a science. Every individual is a little bit different. One of the sessions we've taught over the years is about personality types and how to better connect with people, not just with your donors, but even with your organization and the people that you work with. But it's not an easy process. It takes time. It takes patience. Sometimes it can be frustrating. Sometimes you're on the road a long time. Most of these meetings happen in person, although I know that's changing. I think you can have a meaningful conversation with somebody on the phone, in particular in that older age group. And certainly there are all kinds of other ways to connect with people now. We do still find a lot of our clients send handwritten notes to some of their donors on a regular basis, and whether it's celebrating their birthday or whether it's celebrating a holiday or just staying in contact with them. them. Sometimes they'll react. People don't quite get the mail that they used to, especially that group that's 80 plus. They get excited about receiving personal messages through the mail. Now, that's not to say we can't connect with people. You know, I have an 88-year-old mother now, and she and I communicate probably more by text than anything else. So you need to figure out what your donor prefers and find ways that are comfortable. And I think we'll continue to work through the best way, as we've talked about in some of our other podcasts. We believe strongly in a holistic approach, and from a marketing standpoint, figuring out the different ways, whether it's in person or a printed piece or an e-newsletter or social media. All of those pieces play a role. They're all wonderful tools as we build these relationships and grow them so that we can be successful, and more importantly, so we can actually see the donor's vision come to life. They really can be fulfilled that they're doing something significant.
So it sounds like what you're saying is a lot of the different strategies for maintaining relationships with these donors involves a lot of listening and just understanding the donor's intentions and what they want for their legacy. And then the anecdote you told earlier about the gentleman who was on the board selecting the dean, it sounds like you engaged in a lot of creativity, problem solving, thinking outside of the box, all these different strategies for connecting with your donors. Now, I know that you mentioned sending postcards and handwritten notes. I know that sending a Christmas card every year is maybe not quite enough, and we're going to be doing lots of visits in person, or as you mentioned, nowadays the technology is changing. They might not be always in person, and that might not always be feasible. But if you are going to have a donor visit or communicate with a donor over Zoom, what are some steps to planning that visit?
So, yeah, that's a great question, Grant. And I think we've all become much more comfortable in these virtual platforms, and so have our donors. And I do a fair amount of work now. One of the things we've talked about is this group of baby boomers that are in the middle of this great wealth transfer, and many of those are starting to think about retirement or are retiring or they're selling a business. So I'm having more of these Zoom calls now, not just with the donor, but multiple advisors. So I'll give you one example. I actually have a gift that I worked on last year, and the donor was selling his business. And there was an opportunity for us to do something really fun, but it required communications with his financial advisor, his attorney, and actually his son, who was going to be managing the money. And all of them lived in different places. The donor was in Chicago. The attorney was in New York. The financial advisor was in LA. But we found a way to get these meetings together and then have the important conversations to bring this gift to conclusion, which is so important. So I think it's a little bit about managing expectations. And I'll give you an example. Let's talk just a minute about personal visits. So one of the things that I always did, and a lot of my meetings, because it's been a few years since I did a lot of those in-person meetings that I was creating as a fundraiser, I would typically say, I'm going to be in town and I would love to visit with you. If it's possible, could I come by your house? Let's just spend a little time together, 20, 30 minutes. I just want to talk a little business and make sure I share a little bit about what's happening at the university. And then I'd love to take you out to lunch or take you out to dinner or whatever that may be. And it's amazing what you can learn if you go to someone's home or office. Either of those would work. And you can see the family pictures. You can see what kind of home they have. What's interesting about Plan Giving over the years, going to the house that's worth $4 or $5 million versus the home that may be worth $300,000 or $400,000, we seem to find more people making legacy gifts with the $300,000 house. That multi-million-dollar house a lot of times may have a large mortgage or they may have a fancy car. So it is interesting that you can learn, but more importantly, you have a chance to sit in their home and ask them a lot of questions. Do you have a business? What kind of business is it? Who owns it? So you can gather information. I would say my general rule of thumb, and this would be true on a Zoom call as well, or Teams or whatever it is, you want to spend the majority of your time listening. You want to ask a lot of open-ended questions and then really be quiet and listen to what the donor has to say. It's also really important, we don't talk enough about this, if there is a husband and wife or if there's partners, if there are multiple people involved, you need to have a meeting with both of them. You never quite know, is it the husband or the wife? Which of them is really the decision maker? And more importantly, you want them to be making these decisions together. It's more likely that they'll happen, right? But I think for Zoom meetings, it's more about trying to at least share what your goals are. What are we trying to do? And any meeting, in particular, if it's in person, you want to do a little pre-planning. The other thing that I learned over the years, and this is more important, I think, today than ever before, is if you're communicating with somebody, if at all possible, have another member of the team with you. And in particular, in an in-person meeting. And the reason I say that is because, as we talked about, you want to spend 70, 80% of your time listening. And if you're talking to the donor, you get a little caught up in thinking about what you're going to ask next or what you want to share next, and you just don't listen as well, right? But if you're there with another member of the team, or you've taken the president on a call, or a board member, or if you work in healthcare, it can be a chair of one of the departments, whoever may also, and ideally, maybe it's somebody that can really connect with this donor. But the point is, when you're there with multiple people and one of your colleagues is speaking, then you have a much better chance to really listen. You can really sit there and pay attention and learn as much as you can, because that's the goal. Then the other thing, which is much easier to do now after you've had this call, is to take a minute and make some notes. Now, of course, in my window, a lot of times we were writing those notes down. I actually did have a little handheld recorder I used to use. But now you have these apps on your phone. It's so easy to share. You can pick up your iPhone or your smartphone, whatever it is, and just share names of the family members or something you picked up in the meeting. Maybe you learned that they own some appreciated art, or they have some appreciated securities, or they're selling a business, or they have a significant amount of money in their IRA and they're now over 70 and a half years old. And then all of that can be put into written form and put into a file for you now. So I think pre-planning is really important. I think key to listening during the call. And then the final piece is making sure you document what you did on that call so that you remember to be more effective going forward. And then I'll just make one final comment. One of my mentors, Bill Sturdivant, who ran the program at the University of Illinois for a number of years, and I had the privilege to work with and learn from, he believed really strongly that you have a strategy. You're not just having a conversation to thank them for the gift and share a little bit about what's going on, but you want to move them forward in some way. And it might be as simple as inviting them back to campus for a visit, or inviting them to come to an event. Or it might also, as you move along, it might also be a conversation about what are some of the smart ways that you could give. And I want to share some stories about other donors. I have this donor who's 75 years old, and she realized she could start giving this money from her IRA and she wouldn't have to pay charitable income taxes. She wouldn't have to pay income taxes on that, right? So although she wouldn't get a charitable deduction, this is a wonderful way for her to give, right? And we talk about that often. But again, it's a holistic approach. I think you have to be smart, you have to be strategic, and you have to be realistic about how quickly you move these people forward, because it will take some time.
So it is a holistic approach. And you said something interesting that I guess I've never really thought about before, but it seems like visits in person with the donor are the best way to go about it. And I know that's not always feasible, but you mentioned about being in someone's home and how much you can actually learn just from being in someone's environment. And I thought that was a really interesting point. But again, it's not always feasible to visit our donors in person as much as we would like to. So what are some other ways, and you touched on these earlier, but what are some other ways to keep in touch on, I guess, both a personal level with the donors if you can't visit them in person? You know, you mentioned Zoom and things like that, but are there some other strategies, both personally and I guess from a marketing standpoint, to communicate with these donors consistently?
No, great questions. And I think a little more challenging now than it was 10, 15 years ago. I still think the most important work for those people that are going to make, 6, 7, 8, even 9-figure gifts. And those are the ones that we want to spend a fair amount of time, because that's what's so critical for our, we all understand the majority of the fundraising that happens today. It's a smaller group of people, but the gifts are larger, right? So identifying those people and talking to them about those big gifts is so important for our long-term success. So having said that, I think you have to be very strategic about those people that you can go see in person, because there's only so many people you can see. But I think I mentioned this, you can have a meaningful conversation with somebody on the phone, and think there are lots of touches. We talk about in our business, the real work that we do is sort of like dripping from a faucet. You just want to make sure you continue to remind them that you're here, that their giving matters, and it's important. It's important work that you're doing, and their support is critical for your success. Having said that, it does get challenging trying to figure out the balance between, we have some of the, in particular, we have donors who are widows or widowers who don't have family. Sometimes they're calling us once a week, and you don't want to do that. That's kind of crossing a line. But there are ways, as we've talked about, the newsletters that we send out, particular people older like to hold that piece in their hand and read that. I really do think the personal notes are critical. critical. What's the magical number in terms of how many touches you have a year? I think every person's a little different. You want to communicate with them the way they want to be communicated with. So it's important to ask them, do you want a piece printed in the mail? Would you rather receive an e-message of some sort or an e-newsletter? Are you comfortable with me texting you? Would you rather talk on the phone? And some of that can be done with surveys. I think there's been a lot of success recently through the survey world, something you might want to explore. But every donor is a little bit different. And again, how many people could you see every year? It's harder to travel. But I think Zoom meetings can work. I will share one other story. I found one of our independent high schools, and of course you have the opportunity for 40 and fifth class reunions and that kind of thing is a big opportunity. But they actually had a special quarterly meeting, and it was their sports teams. And it was unique. So this one school had a really well-known lacrosse team, and they'd had a lot of success. And in particular, 15, 20, 30 years ago was a little bit earlier in that space. And so they had a special meeting. They did about a 5-year window where they met 2, 3, 4 times a year. And some of them hadn't really kept in touch over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And they got together just to talk about their experiences when they were playing on this successful lacrosse team earlier back when they were in college together. So I think finding ways to get people to come together. The other area we've seen in the university space where there's been a lot of success, of course, is university faculty that have retired. They have significant money in these retirement plans. They put all this money in those 403B plans year after year after year. Finding a way to bring them back to campus with people, sort of their peer group, if you will, I think that becomes really important. Involving volunteers can be another really effective way. So I have another client, and I think they identified 6 or 8 alumni who had become part of a C-suite for well-known Fortune 500 companies. And so they started having a little alumni gathering, and this was done virtually as well. They were meeting a couple times a year just to share not just their experiences at the university, but share some of their challenges in their leadership roles with these big companies. So finding a connection, I think, is really important to keep them engaged, because as we all understand, most of these legacy gifts are a traditional will or a beneficiary designation. All of that is revocable, and it can be changed. And if you're not staying in touch with them in that later stage in life when they write their final will, then you're out. And it's just that simple. So you got to find a way, be creative. Don't just do Christmas letters, maybe do a July 4th note. We have some people that do Thanksgiving cards. So try and be creative, think outside the box. There's lots of creative ways to communicate with people. Find something that works for your organizations that's unique.
So it really comes down to personal connection and listening and meeting your donors where they're at and how they want to be communicated with. So you might end up having more frequent conversations with certain donors, and maybe other donors just kind of want you to touch base with them a couple times a year or something. Let me ask one last question. Nonprofits have board members and other leadership. What role can those people in those levels play in donor stewardship and donor visits?
So, yeah, great question. When I worked in the medical field, in particular, when I worked for Rush Medical Center in Chicago, I was involved in a major capital campaign. One of the things that was unique about the business owners is it was really helpful. Let's say you had somebody who was the CEO of a well-known company and they were well-respected in the community, and you knew they were already committed. So let's say they're the chair of your board. It could be very effective if you got them to go tell their story in person and share how much money they were given. So, for example, one of the CEOs I worked with actually was the CEO of Sears. This was a number of years ago, and they were very effective. And I also worked with the CEO of United, and he was a real interesting character. But it really helped. So his last name was Wolf, Stephen Wolf, and he was a real interesting guy. He was probably 6'2", and he always wore these cowboy boots and a big cowboy hat. So he looked bigger even then when he was in person. But to have him sit across the table and say, Grant, I'm giving $4 million to this project, and it's going to have a huge impact, and I'd like to see you, since you've also been very successful in your leadership role, I'd like to see you give the same amount. So I think that peer-to-peer ask can be really effective, especially with volunteers and people that are in leadership roles with the organization. They can be in a better position because they know these people and they can relate to them.
That's great. I really love hearing these individual stories, specific donors that you've worked with. And I think it's a good reminder that donors also really respond to hearing stories of other donors. And so I think it is important for organizations to continue sharing those stories and get other donors inspired. This has been a really great conversation. And just to distill it a little bit, it seems like maintaining and fostering long-term and successful donor relations really comes down to connection, creativity, listening, asking open-ended questions. But I do think probably just sitting there and listening and getting to know your donors is probably one of the most important elements of this. Well, Joe, thanks so much for being on the show. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and we appreciate your insights and your expertise, and we look forward to having you back on.
Fantastic, Grant. Thanks. Honored to play a role. I can't wait for the next one.
Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.